It's very crowded in here. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. Research from Amplify Media and Podnews recently showed that there are only 155,000 regularly updated podcasts. But what category are they in? We worked on the data to show the most and least crowded active categories. You'll find it linked from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Amplify Media has also announced it's to work with the Radio Advertising Bureau in the US to benchmark local podcast ad revenue for radio stations. A new version of AI voice tool Veritone Voice has been released, or as they say,
Veritone Incorporated, creator of AIware, a hyper-expansive enterprise AI platform, today unveiled its next-generation Veritone Voice.
You can watch a Sounds Profitable deep dive into how the tool works with Brian Barletta and Fisher Robison of Veritone. You'll find that linked too from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Podimo, the European subscription podcast service, has raised $58.5 million in funding. It's previously raised more than $116 million. Audio recording and collaboration company Nomono has announced $3.6 million in funding too. Baltimore City's state attorney has asked for a new trial for Adnan Syed after new information has come to light that points to alternative suspects. Cell phone tower information has also been shown to be unreliable. The case, of course, highlighted in the first season of Serial. Podcast Day 24 in Sydney, London and New York City has announced more of their speakers. We hear that Sounds Profitable's Tom Webster will be releasing more data from the creators in New York City. London will feature the podcast of the year, Dear Daughter, and Sydney will include a focus on new and emerging formats from listeners Jen Goggin. The code PODN1215 gets in-person tickets at around half price and includes full video catch-up of all three events. Australia has a new number one for podcasting, kind of. Triton Digital's ranker says Listener is the number one sales representation podcast network, now representing 5.9 million monthly listeners. The network added Stitcher and Audio Chuck's content to its numbers. However, ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia still also remains the number one podcast publisher and saw a 6.5% growth in total downloads. The Infinite Dial, a study of media habits including podcast listening from Edison Research, is coming to New Zealand later this year. Patreon is to lay off 80 employees, it's announced. Podcast information tool Podkite has released a number of updates and also released big differences in rating scores for each country. 30% of all ratings given in Afghanistan are 1 star, more than double the second most grumpy country, Brunei, at 14%. Places that are most positive, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the only country with love in its name, Slovenia. AdTonos is preparing to launch something they call Yours Truly, quotes giving brands the power of real conversation in their advertising by interacting with listeners just by voice. The launch was due today, but has been postponed. Why is every podcast seemingly sponsored by a VPN? Michael Girdley had access to one company's profit and loss sheet, which makes it very clear. And Third Ear Studio, a podcast studio making subscription content in Sweden, claims more than 20,000 subscribers, each paying $5 a month. It's just gained a $1 million investment. And in People News, Alison Marino is now Senior Director of Revenue Partnerships at SiriusXM. She moves from iHeartMedia, where she was podcast slate lead. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.